It's my privilege today to announce an exciting new partnership between PBSI and CTU. One of our initial endeavors at PBSI will be to partner with CTU to establish a Precious Blood Spirituality Institute here at CTU. We want to continue our community's mission of justice and reconciliation by offering courses, workshops, and supporting academic research that will advance this distinct tradition in the church. The decision to establish the work of the Institute at CTU is based particularly on the prominent role that Bob Schreiter had at this school. A brilliant and internationally recognized scholar and teacher, Bob focused his research on the integration of Catholicism within local cultures, and particularly on the urgent mission of reconciliation in our modern world, a direct expression of his precious blood spirituality. In his honor, the new institute will bear the official name, the Robert J. Schreiter CPPS Institute for Precious Blood Spirituality, and the Schreiter Institute will become a part of the Bernardine Center. It's our hope that the spirituality which has been nurtured and put into action by the sisters, the brothers, the priests, the lay associates of our congregations will be carried out into the world and become a way of life for many others. Precious blood spirituality is a living gift to a suffering world, much in need of its message of God's boundless love, of hope and healing, and of accompaniment and compassion. And now it's my privilege to introduce and welcome another member of the Precious Blood community, Sister Kyong. Sister Kyong is a recent graduate of CTU. Bob Schreiter was a mentor to her and during her years here, and he also served as her thesis project director as she completed her Doctor in Ministry degree. Her lecture is entitled A Spirituality of Reconciliation, Robert Schreiter, a reconciling presence in integrity of heart. Please join me in welcoming Sister Kyong.
Good afternoon again. It is ironic that I'm here to talk about the spirituality of reconciliation in memory of Bob Schreiter. How I wished to do a ministry of reconciliation with him alive. Now, however, I find myself feeling his presence more beyond time and space, which I never did before. He is still present to us in our memories through feelings, photos, and stories we share in person. Besides, he will present to us in the knowledge he shared and continues to share with us in his theological scholarship through his written materials on reconciliation and inculturation. When I recall him, I realize that he was a living witness of what he taught. Thus, what the future students will not know and learn from the printed voices is how his person was integrated with his knowledge. What he preached in the reconciliation classroom, he also preached through his personal presence. Students can only learn that wisdom, that integrated knowledge of a teacher by witnessing through his or her presence of the teacher in integrity of heart. It is very obvious that Schreiter was not just teaching reconciliation as a spirituality, but lived and was present to us as a reconciling presence in integrity of heart. In this sense, he was not only a teacher, but also a minister and missionary to us who witnessed the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ. Therefore, this presentation is about the spirituality of reconciliation drawn from Bob Schreiter as a minister of reconciliation. This presentation is like weaving a tapestry that is woven in a specific loom with warp again already prepared. In the image of the weaving, it has three parts: a loom, a warp, and a weft. First, the loom, which symbolizes the foundation of Schreiter's spirituality of reconciliation will be addressed very briefly, showing from where his theology of reconciliation developed. Second, his spirituality and ministry of reconciliation will be summarized with 5 central points as the warp. Finally, from there, Weft, a reconciling presence in integrity of our heart, as a spirituality of reconciliation for ministers, will be portrayed. The Loom. In his book, In Water and in Blood, we see how Robert Schreiter's theology and spirituality of reconciliation developed from the spirituality of the blood of Christ as a member of the Missionary Society of the Precious Blood. He returned to the biblical root of a spirituality of the blood of Christ and saw the connection of the blood of Christ and the blood of the oppressed in our world's reality. He defines the spirituality of the blood of Christ as, beginning of quote, a spirituality witnessing to God's great love for humanity by pouring out our own life for the sake of overcoming sin and offering in our world. A spirituality willing to mediate the boundary between life and death, and a spirituality of the go-between, finding a way to translate the death-dealing events of a society into a resource for life. End of quote. Recognizing the saving power of God's love through the blood of Christ for all humanity, he examines the saving power of the blood of Christ with 2 concepts, redemption and reconciliation. He wrote, beginning of quote, redemption helps us see how the saving power of Christ's blood can transform what seems to be an utterly destructive situation of suffering or oppression into something that can elevate the human spirit rather than drag it down. Reconciliation looks to a cessation of the hostility and conflict that keeps individuals and communities apart and becoming of a new creation. End of quote. Therefore, he sees that redemption happens in reconciliation in our fractured world today by the transformation of becoming a new creation. By reflecting on the spirituality of the blood of Christ and accompanying people in the divided world, he concludes that the reconciliation is the mission of the church today. The warp, Christian reconciliation as spirituality and its development. In the reality of the conflict and division in the world, and shaped by the spirituality of the blood of Christ, Schreiter summarized the Christian reconciliation in 5 central points. First, Christian reconciliation is the work of God who initiates and completes reconciliation in us through Christ. Second, Christian reconciliation is more spirituality than strategy, in which God begins with the healing of the victim. Third, Christian reconciliation makes of both victim and wrongdoers a new creation. Fourth, the process of reconciliation is to be found in the story of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Fifth, the reconciliation will be only fulfilled with the complete consummation of the word by God. And Schreiter connects these 5 affirmations of Christian reconciliation in dealing with conflict as more for transformation than resolution. By the first and the last points, that God is the source of reconciliation in initiation and completion, we learn to appreciate the complexity of situations, both in the past and in the present, of the whys and hows, by allowing the multiple perspective we cannot capture. Through this recognition, we can acknowledge the risen Jesus among the living. The second point, Christian reconciliation is more spirituality than a strategy, indicates the healing and transformation of victims. the recognition that human beings are created in the image of God must be acknowledged by all who are involved in reconciliation process, especially victims. By recognizing their own dignity and discovering how God works in their lives, they can accept the responsibility to collaborate with God for their healing and transformation by telling the truth of their stories. From finding their own voice in telling the stories, the gradual change of the stories toward a new narrative, as well as the healing of memories, can be revealed. In this sense, they become active agents of reconciliation. The third point, the process of Christian reconciliation makes both victim and wrongdoer a new creation, leads us to reflect on the mysteries of identity that frequently come into play in division and conflict. Division presents the boundary issues of belonging for identity, us versus them, the white versus the color. Schreiter observes that the resistance to change comes out of fear of losing something related with self-identity. The fear of losing self leads to a dialogue stalemate. However, the ultimate value of the Christian is that we are created by God in His own image. This urges the agents of reconciliation from both sides to change, to grow, and to be transformed by God in dialogue. The fourth affirmation that the process of reconciliation is found in the Paschal mystery of Jesus draws us to attending to the suffering and the wound. By attending the wounds, it teaches us something about our past and ourselves, and reveals to us a new meaning that arises from it. In this sense, our wound is a locus where we can meet Jesus in the stories of Passover. Through the personal experience of meeting Jesus, we share our own suffering and death in our wounds with Him. In our wound, our suffering can be reframed, and the wound became the redemptive space to recognize the risen Jesus. We also experienced the healing and redemption in the Passover narrative of Jesus. In the final affirmation that it is God who will bring reconciliation to its completion, it leads us to see time from the perspective of God. It also implies that there is no way to skip the process to gain the goal on our own. The work of God in reconciliation is an ongoing process to us throughout our own lifetimes, or sometimes even beyond to the next generation. This allows us to be present and patient in the process of God's time. While conflict resolution focuses more on the problem that needs to be fixed, Christian reconciliation as conflict transformation pays more attention to the participants who are agents of the work for transformation in God. By attending Christian reconciliation as conflict transformation for the agents, Schreiter perceives Christian reconciliation as a social formation process. Reconciliation as a process implies a gradual formation of rebuilding relationships. It begins with knowing where we are in this process and where we need to go from there. After setting up the starting point and the goal, we need to navigate how to reach the goal. Schreiter suggests 3 roadmaps as a metaphor to help us find the way to the goal for those who travel an unfamiliar land. The first roadmap is the goal of a spiritual reconciliation that is reached by a conversion of the human heart. The second roadmap is to the goal of social reconciliation of justice that tries to discern the absence of right relations in society. These two roadmaps are related to Schreiter's early development of the two phases of reconciliation, spiritual and social. Although each of the roadmaps can be taken depending on which territory of the individuals are in, they cannot totally be separated. We need both roadmaps as individuals and as members of society. The third roadmap to reconciliation was developed later from his past decades of work in reconciliation and peace efforts. This roadmap lies in between social and spiritual phases of reconciliation as the liminal space. He calls it alternative social formation. Alternative social formations are alternative spaces that deals with all three dimensions of time: the present state of the victim or wrongdoer, the healing of memory in the past, and the future by imagination. Schreiter says, beginning of quote, "They are spaces that allow for movement between all three of these dimensions of time. That movement is made possible by recourse to ritual, a performance that can link these different dimensions in such a way as to make each and all of them present to us." End of quote. Thus, for Schreiter, Christian reconciliation as spirituality is understood as a liminal space that links spiritual and social formation towards transformation and integration for the participants who are agents and actors of reconciliation. The Weft, reconciling presence in integration, integrity of heart as a spirituality of reconciliation. So, how can we think about the spirituality of reconciliation for ministers with Robert Schreiter as an example of ministers of reconciliation? In the section of the strategies of the Ministry of Reconciliation, he named 8 actors of reconciliation: victims, wrongdoers, bystanders, both who were victims and wrongdoers, the dead, future generations, neighbors, and God. He didn't name ministers as an actor in reconciliation. It is because a minister can connect herself or himself as one of them in the category. In the Ministry of Reconciliation, ministers are facilitators who need to be aware of the dynamic in the liminal space, and yet they are participants who need to live a spirituality of reconciliation. The participation of ministers in reconciliation ministry, such as the Healing Circle, is fulfilled through their personal presence to the people they minister to by witnessing reconciliation by their own reconciling presence. For spirituality of reconciliation, we need to understand what spirituality means here. Sandra Schneider describes spirituality as a personal or communal project that consciously integrates the whole person, both to a broader participation in the world as well as a deeper engagement with one's ultimate values. End of quote. Clara May Streeter illustrates Christian spirituality as, beginning of quote, real or authentic human presence to live the reality in light of the explicit mystery of Christ Jesus. End of quote. By these definitions, Christian spirituality indicates a personal or communal characteristics of being holistic, integrative, and authentic presence to both in the world and in the mystery of Jesus Christ. Then how do we understand real presence in the spirituality of Christian reconciliation? Gerald O. Collins, in his book Christology, signifies the notion of presence in developing a Christology of presence. He begins with drawing 9 essential components of presence from philosophy. Presence is personal, relational, and a free act through which presence creates communion. Presence comes across as vulnerable and bodily or spatial. Presence is mediated among human beings by symbol, such as photos and letters. Presence is endlessly various in qualities and modes, and presence is primordially feminine. Presence, by its expression, presence to or presence of, indicates that it is a mode or a tone of being in relation to something or someone, not simply being itself. In other words, one's modes of presence can be different in different relationships. One can be physically present to someone but absent in mind, or one can be physically absent to while at the same time present to someone in heart and memory. Thus, the question of how fully one is present to or what kind of presence implies that presence is a form of a free self-giving act. One's conscious choice of full presence to is an exercise of personal freedom. Presence to also indicates one's presence to oneself. Whenever we are present to any experience and coming to ourselves, it forms interpreted knowledge. Self-knowledge indicates consciousness of one's presence to oneself. Conscious self-knowing by one's presence to oneself also allows the presence of the perceived object in the perceiver, which implies communion, a mutual interpersonal presence of the known in the knower. Therefore, free self-giving presence of the known breaks into the knower's life and touches the heart that unveils a new possibility. Collins says, beginning of quote, "Such active presence means disclosing oneself, sharing one's presence, and making others at home with an unconditional hospitality that gives and enhances life." End of quote. As a presence is relational, whether it is presence to oneself or presence to others, it is important to pay attention to trustworthiness, especially in reconciliation ministry and for those who live in the spirituality of reconciliation. Trust is a very important value for the victims. John Hadley sees the need of authenticity and integration of oneself in personal presence in connection to trust in relationships. Because personal presence is a statement of I amness. In this sense, if the statement is not true, the presence is not there, and trust cannot be built. Hardly says, beginning of quote, "True presence demands that there is openness, integration of verbal and non-verbal messages, and a level of trustworthiness which others can recognize and respond to with their own honest replies." End of quote. Personal presence can be costly, such as spending time, money, occupying a place, or sometimes more than that. In our world of division and violence, sometimes we are called to choose our presence by risking our lives in the ministry of reconciliation. The free act, self-giving personal presence can leave ministers vulnerable. However, the feminine dimension of presence helps us see the cost of this sacrifice as life-giving. A mother becomes a safe space in communion with the baby and spends a sufficient time in being vulnerable. She is fully present to the baby and gives birth to a new life by risking her own life. Conclusion. Christian response Christian reconciliation indicates that it is more spirituality than strategy in a world of division and violence. Then Christian spirituality is about the consciousness or conscious integrity of the whole person, both in the world and in God, as well as an authentic presence in the light of the mystery of Jesus Christ to the world. Thus, spirituality of Christian reconciliation implies real reconciling presence of one in ministry in self-integration. Schreiter suggested two practices of Christian spirituality in reconciliation: creating a safe and hospitable space and contemplative prayer. This indicates how he was consciously aware of his presence to himself as well as to others, to be an authentic presence of reconciliation in integrity of heart. Through the years of his ministry in dedication to reconciliation in classrooms and in the places where reconciliation was much needed, Bob Schreiter himself was also being transformed by the Holy Spirit. His knowledge was integrated with the heart of Christ, and he became a reconciling presence to the people to whom and with whom he ministered in our fractured world. The life of the Father Robert Schreiter, a missionary of the Precious Blood, witnessed a spirituality of reconciliation. Schreiter's personal reconciling presence to each and every student was such an energetic presence, whether in or out of the classroom. He disclosed himself, shared his presence, and made the students feel at home with his unconditional hospitality, which created a safe space for students to speak out the truth of their stories. And his active personal presence to others came through his presence to himself in self-knowledge that was deepened in communion with Christ's saving power of the blood of Christ. Bob, we miss you, and yet we know that you are with us as we remember you. Thank you.